I never thought my life could change so abruptly, but that morning, everything I knew was shattered. It started as a regular day. I was sipping coffee in the kitchen, scrolling through my phone, when Rachel, my wife, left hers on the counter as she hurried to the shower. Her phone buzzed. Just a simple notification sound. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but something made me look. Maybe it was the name that flashed across the screen, Jackson. Jackson Marshall was the successful businessman everyone in town admired. The same Jackson who had always seemed too friendly with Rachel. My hands moved on their own as I unlocked her phone, the password we shared without a second thought. What I found left me cold. Their text messages weren't just friendly. They were explicit, full of plans they had made, places they had been, together. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat louder than the last. The air around me felt thick and suffocating, as if the walls of the kitchen were closing in. I scrolled further, hoping against hope that I had misunderstood, but it only got worse. Each message was like a dagger, piercing deeper into the image I had of our marriage. The betrayal, the lies, it was all there in black and white. I heard the water stop running upstairs. Rachel would be out of the shower soon. I needed answers, and I needed them now. My hands were shaking as I set her phone back down on the counter. I didn't know if I was more furious or heartbroken, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let this slide. When Rachel walked into the kitchen, her hair still wet, she looked so innocent, so oblivious. I could barely contain my rage as I asked, "Who is Jackson to you, Rachel?" The look on her face told me everything before she even spoke. Her eyes widened in shock, then fear, as she realized what I must have seen. "Liam, I can explain," she stammered, reaching for her phone. I grabbed it before she could, holding it up like evidence in a trial. "Explain? You want to explain this?" My voice was louder than I intended. But I couldn't control it. The anger was taking over. "How long has this been going on?" She didn't answer right away. She just stood there, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to find the right words. Finally, she said, "It was a mistake, Liam. It's over. I ended it." "Over?" I laughed bitterly. "You expect me to believe that? After everything I just saw?" She took a step closer, her hand reaching out to touch my arm, but I pulled away. "Liam, please. It didn't mean anything. It's you I love. It's always been you. Don't touch me," I snapped, stepping back. "If it didn't mean anything, why did you keep it going? Why did you lie to me?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. All I could think about was the months of deceit, the time she had spent with him instead of me, and the way she had shattered my trust. "Get out," I said, my voice cold. "I need you to leave. Liam, we can work this out. Please, just," I said, "get out." I roared, and this time, she listened. She grabbed her purse and keys, her eyes filled with tears, and fled from the house. I stood there, breathing heavily, the silence that followed more deafening than any argument. The weight of what had just happened crashed down on me. I slumped into a chair, burying my face in my hands. How could she do this? How could she betray me like this? The hurt, the anger, it was all too much. I needed to do something, anything, to escape the overwhelming pain. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rachel with Jackson, their messages replaying in my mind like a broken record. By dawn, I had made a decision. If I couldn't control what happened to me, I could at least control how I responded. I needed an outlet, a way to channel the rage boiling inside me. That's when I remembered a conversation I'd had with a colleague about extreme sports. He'd mentioned the thrill of skydiving, the rush of free falling through the sky, and for the first time since discovering the affair, I felt a spark of interest. That morning, I booked my first jump. I didn't care about the risks, didn't care about anything but escaping the thoughts that were tearing me apart. The minute I stepped out of that plane, the wind roaring past me, everything else disappeared. The fear, the anger, the betrayal, it was all gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated adrenaline. But as soon as my feet touched the ground, it all came rushing back. No matter how many times I jumped, no matter how many mountains I climbed or cliffs I scaled, I couldn't escape the reality of what Rachel had done. The physical pain from the bruises and cuts I collected was nothing compared to the emotional pain gnawing at me. I found myself drawn deeper into the world of extreme sports, each new challenge more dangerous than the last. It wasn't just about the thrill anymore, it was about punishing myself, testing my limits to see how much I could take before I broke. But no matter how hard I pushed, it wasn't enough. The anger was still there, simmering just beneath the surface, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it boiled over. One night, after a particularly grueling climb, I sat alone in my car, staring out at the city lights. My mind drifted back to Jackson, the man who had taken everything from me. I thought about how easy it had been for him to waltz into my life and destroy it, and how he was probably out there somewhere, living his life without a care in the world. The thought made my blood boil. I wasn't just angry anymore, I wanted revenge. And that's when the idea first crossed my mind. What if I took matters into my own hands? What if I made Jackson pay for what he did? I knew it was crazy, dangerous even, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. He had taken everything from me, and now it was my turn to take something from him. But this wouldn't be just any act of revenge, it had to be something that would make him suffer the way I had suffered. That night, I made the decision. I would kidnap Jackson, and this time, I wouldn't be the one left broken. The idea of kidnapping Jackson took root in my mind, growing stronger with each passing day. I couldn't let go of the image of him with Rachel, the way he had stolen what was mine. Every time I thought about it, the anger surged again, and I knew I had to act. But I wasn't a criminal, I had no idea where to start. I spent hours online, researching everything I could about kidnapping, surveillance, and even how to make someone disappear without a trace. It was surreal, like I was living someone else's life, but the more I learned, the more determined I became. If I was going to do this, I needed a solid plan. The first step was gathering information. I began following Jackson, learning his routines, where he went, and who he met. It wasn't hard, his life was public enough that I could predict his movements with ease. He was always at the same gym in the morning, the same office downtown, and the same upscale bars at night. He was arrogant, always assuming he was safe, always assuming he was untouchable. But he wasn't. I spent weeks tailing him, building a profile, looking for the perfect moment to strike. I knew I couldn't do it alone, so I reached out to a contact I had made in the extreme sports community. Nate was a thrill seeker like me, but he had a darker side. Rumors swirled about his past, about how he funded his lifestyle. I approached him carefully, suggesting the idea as if it were just a wild fantasy, but Nate took to it immediately. "I've got some guys who'd be into this," he said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "But it's gonna cost you." Money wasn't a problem. Rachel and I had been saving for years, building a nest egg for the future. The future I had once dreamed of with her was now gone, but the money remained. I withdrew a substantial amount, careful to avoid raising suspicion, and handed it over to Nate. He introduced me to his team, two men who looked like they had seen more than their share of trouble. They didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer explanations. We went over the plan again and again until every detail was perfect. The target, the location, the getaway, everything had to be flawless. The night before the kidnapping, I could hardly sleep. My mind raced with possibilities, with what-ifs. Was I really going to do this? Was I ready to cross this line? But every time doubt crept in, I forced it out, reminding myself of the betrayal, the hurt, the pain that Jackson had caused me. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice. At dawn, I met Nate and his men at the agreed-upon location, a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place was perfect, isolated, with no prying eyes. We went over the plan one last time before setting out. Jackson was on his way to a business meeting, his driver cruising down the highway. We followed at a distance, the tension in the car palpable. As Jackson's car approached the agreed spot, Nate's men executed the plan flawlessly. A staged accident forced Jackson's driver to pull over, and before he knew what was happening, they had him out of the car and into ours. I watched from the front seat as Jackson was shoved into the back, a hood thrown over his head. He struggled, shouting, but it was useless. Nate's men subdued him quickly, tying his hands and feet with expert precision. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of fear and exhilaration. I had done it. I had actually done it. We drove to the warehouse in silence, the gravity of what I had just done beginning to sink in. But there was no turning back now. I had set this in motion, and I would see it through to the end. We reached the warehouse, and Nate's men dragged Jackson inside. They removed the hood from his head, and for the first time, I saw the fear in his eyes. He looked around frantically, trying to make sense of what was happening, but he couldn't see me in the shadows. "Who are you? What do you want?" Jackson demanded, his voice trembling. It was a far cry from the confident, smooth-talking businessman I had seen in public. Now, he was just a man who realized he was in deep trouble. Nate and his men didn't answer. They secured Jackson to a chair in the middle of the room, making sure he couldn't move. I stayed back, watching, my mind racing. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment I would confront the man who had destroyed my life. But something stopped me from stepping forward. I wasn't ready. There was something more I needed to know. I motioned for Nate to step outside with me, leaving Jackson alone in the darkened warehouse. Outside, I could hear the distant hum of the city, a reminder that life was going on as usual for everyone else. But not for me, and certainly not for Jackson. What now? Nate asked, lighting a cigarette. You want us to rough him up? Get some answers? I shook my head. Not yet. I need to know more about him. There's something he's hiding, I can feel it. Nate gave me a skeptical look but shrugged. It's your call, but if you want to dig into his past, you might find more than you're ready for. I ignored the warning and spent the next few hours searching through Jackson's belongings that Nate's men had confiscated. His phone, his briefcase, even his wallet, it was all there, waiting to be picked apart. I found nothing of interest at first, just the usual business documents and personal items. But then, as I scrolled through his phone, I stumbled upon an encrypted folder. It took some time, but I managed to crack the encryption. What I found inside made my blood run cold. Jackson wasn't just a cheating husband, he was involved in something much darker. Emails, documents, and photos revealed a web of illegal activities, from money laundering to insider trading. He was part of a criminal organization, using his business as a front to move millions of dollars in dirty money. The enormity of what I had discovered hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just about Rachel anymore. This was about something much bigger. Jackson was dangerous, and if I wasn't careful, I could get caught in the crossfire. I returned to the warehouse, my mind racing with this new information. Jackson looked up as I entered, his eyes narrowing as he tried to figure out who I was. Why are you doing this? He demanded, his voice steadier now as if he had regained some of his composure. If it's money you want, I can pay you. I stepped into the light, revealing myself for the first time. This isn't about money, Jackson, I said coldly. This is about payback, for what you did to me, and for the lives you've ruined. Recognition dawned on his face, followed by a flash of fear. Liam? He whispered. Is this about Rachel? My jaw clenched at the sound of her name, but I kept my voice steady. That's part of it, but now I know what else you've been up to. His face went pale as he realized I had uncovered his secrets. You don't know what you're getting into, he warned. These people, if they find out what you've done, they'll come after you. They'll kill you. I'm not afraid of them, I lied. In truth, the fear was starting to creep in, but I pushed it down. I had come too far to back out now. Jackson looked desperate, his bravado crumbling. Let me go, and I'll forget this ever happened. I'll leave Rachel alone. We can pretend this never happened. I shook my head. It's too late for that. You're going to pay for what you've done. The only question is how. As I stood there, staring at the man who had torn my life apart, I realized that I had a choice to make. I could use this information to destroy him, to take revenge for everything he had done. Or I could turn it over to the authorities and bring down the entire criminal operation he was a part of. The choice wasn't easy. Revenge was tempting, but it wouldn't fix the damage that had been done. And if I didn't act carefully, I could end up as collateral damage in Jackson's web of crime. But if I worked with the police, I could take down Jackson and his associates, and maybe, just maybe, find some peace. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I knew I had to do. Here's what's going to happen, Jackson, I said, my voice cold and determined. You're going to help me bring down your operation, or you'll be the one who goes down. The fear in his eyes told me he knew I was serious. And as much as I wanted to see him suffer, I knew this was the only way to end it. The game had changed, and now it was time to play my hand. Jackson sat in the chair, his wrists bound, his eyes darting nervously between me and the door. The power dynamic had shifted, and he knew it. For the first time since I had taken him, I saw genuine fear in his eyes, not just for his own safety, but for what I might force him to do. I don't have a choice, do I? Jackson finally said, his voice breaking the heavy silence. If I help you, they'll kill me. If I don't, you'll make sure I go down for everything. That's right, I replied, my tone flat and unforgiving. But let's be clear, you're not the one making demands here. You'll do exactly what I say, or I'll turn everything I have over to the authorities. And trust me, they'll be more than interested in what I've found." Jackson swallowed hard, his face pale. "All right, I'll cooperate, but you have to protect me. If the people I work with find out I'm involved, it won't just be me. They'll go after my family, too." I hadn't considered that. As much as I despised Jackson for what he'd done, the idea of his family being dragged into this mess didn't sit right with me. But I couldn't afford to show weakness now. "We'll cross that bridge when we get to it," I said, my voice firm. "Right now, you're going to start by telling me everything. Names, locations, operations, I want it all." Jackson hesitated, but he knew he didn't have a choice. Over the next few hours, he laid it all out: the key players in the organization, the offshore accounts, the dirty deals that kept the money flowing. It was a tangled web of corruption and crime, and Jackson was right in the middle of it. The more he talked, the more I realized just how deep this went. Jackson wasn't just a pawn in this game, he was a major player. But despite the gravity of what he was revealing, I couldn't shake the thought of Rachel. She had been just as much a victim in all this, manipulated and used by Jackson without even knowing it. Or at least, that's what I wanted to believe. By the time Jackson finished, I had enough information to bring down the entire operation. But now came the hard part: deciding what to do with it. I could go to the police, turn over everything I had, and let them take it from there. Or I could use this knowledge to my advantage, to make sure Jackson paid for what he'd done to me personally. I glanced at Jackson, who sat slumped in the chair, exhausted and defeated. "You're going to help me take this down," I said, my voice cold and unwavering. "But you're also going to make amends for what you did to me and Rachel." His eyes flickered with something I hadn't seen before: remorse. "Liam, I never meant for this to happen. It got out of hand. I was stupid and reckless. But if you help me, I'll make things right. I swear." I didn't believe him, not entirely. But at this point, it didn't matter. I had the leverage I needed, and I was going to use it. The time for revenge had passed. Now, it was about survival, mine and Rachel's. "We'll see about that," I said, standing up. "For now, you're going to do exactly as I say. And if you try to double-cross me, I won't hesitate to end this. Understand?" Jackson nodded, defeated. "I understand." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Jackson and I put together a plan to bring down the organization from the inside. It was risky. One wrong move, and we'd both be dead. But it was the only way to end this once and for all. Jackson used his connections to arrange a meeting with one of the top members of the organization. A man named Victor Rossi. Rossi was ruthless, the kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who crossed him. But he was also greedy, and Jackson assured me that with the right offer, we could lure him into a trap. The plan was simple: we'd set up a fake deal, using the information Jackson had given me to make it look legitimate. Once Rossi took the bait, I'd have the evidence I needed to bring him down. But it wasn't just about getting Rossi, it was about taking down the entire operation. As the day of the meeting approached, I could feel the tension building. I had never done anything like this before, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. If anything went wrong, if Rossi suspected a trap, we were as good as dead. The night before the meeting, I met with Nate in a dark alley behind a bar. He had been watching our backs, keeping an eye on things while Jackson and I prepared. He was skeptical of Jackson's cooperation, but I assured him it was our best shot. "Are you sure about this, Liam?" Nate asked, his voice low. "This isn't just some adrenaline rush. These people don't mess around. If this goes south, you're not walking away." "I know," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I don't have a choice. This is the only way to end it." Nate studied me for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll be there, just in case. But don't expect me to bail you out if things get hairy." "I wouldn't expect anything less," I said, managing a small smile. Nate was a good friend. But he was also practical. He knew the risks as well as I did. The next morning, Jackson and I drove to the meeting location, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was the perfect place for a deal like this, isolated, with plenty of places to hide. Nate was already there, hidden in the shadows, watching our backs. As we pulled up, Jackson looked at me, his face pale. "Are you sure about this? If Rossi catches wind of what we're doing." "He won't," I cut him off. "Just stick to the plan." We got out of the car and walked into the warehouse. The place was dark and empty, the only sound was the echo of our footsteps. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat louder than the last. This was it, the moment of truth. We didn't have to wait long. Rossi arrived with 2 of his men, all 3 of them armed. The moment they entered the warehouse, I could feel the tension in the air. Rossi was a tall, imposing figure, his eyes cold and calculating. He looked at Jackson, then at me, his expression unreadable. "Jackson," Rossi said, his voice smooth but dangerous. "Who's your friend?" "This is Liam," Jackson replied, keeping his voice steady. "He's here to help with the deal." Rossi's eyes narrowed as he studied me. "I've never heard of you, Liam. What's your angle?" I kept my voice calm, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "No angle. Just business. Jackson told me you're looking to expand, and I have the resources to make that happen." Rossi didn't say anything for a long moment. I could see the gears turning in his mind, trying to figure out if this was a setup. Finally, he nodded. "All right, let's see what you've got." I handed over the briefcase, filled with fake documents and just enough money to make it look real. Rossi's men took it, examining the contents carefully. My heart was in my throat, waiting for the moment they'd realize it was a trap. But they didn't. Rossi smiled, satisfied. "Looks good. We'll move forward with the deal. But I want to meet your other partners. Face to face." This was the moment. I took a deep breath and said, "That can be arranged. But first, we need to finalize the terms." "In private." Rossi nodded, and I motioned for Jackson to step outside with me. We left the warehouse, and the moment we were out of earshot, I pulled out my phone and sent the signal. Nate and the others were waiting nearby, ready to move in the moment we had Rossi alone. Jackson looked at me, his face tense. "Are you sure about this?" "No," I admitted, "but it's the only way." We went back inside, and Rossi's men were already preparing to leave. "This isn't over yet," Rossi said, his tone cold. "We'll be in touch." I nodded, trying to hide the relief that was flooding through me. As they left, I knew we were one step closer to bringing them down. But the hardest part was still ahead. I had put everything on the line, and there was no turning back now. As I stood there, the weight of what I had done hit me. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. I had made a deal with the devil, and now I had to see it through to the end. No matter what it cost me. The day of the final meeting arrived, and the tension was unbearable. We had set everything up perfectly. Rossi believed he was about to close the deal of a lifetime, expanding his criminal empire with the help of Jackson and me. But what he didn't know was that we had laid a trap that would bring him and his entire operation crashing down. Jackson and I arrived at the new meeting location, an even more remote warehouse outside the city. It was isolated enough that no one would stumble upon it by accident, but close enough to the city that the authorities could move in quickly once we gave the signal. As we waited for Rossi to arrive, Jackson was visibly nervous, his hands shaking slightly. "This is it, Liam," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If this goes wrong." "It won't," I interrupted, trying to project confidence I didn't entirely feel. "We've covered every angle. The police are ready, and Nate's team is in position. Rossi won't know what hit him." Jackson nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. I couldn't blame him. We were about to face one of the most dangerous men in the city, and if anything went wrong, we were both as good as dead. Rossi arrived right on time, as expected. He entered the warehouse with his usual entourage, 2 heavily armed bodyguards and a third man I hadn't seen before. This third man was different, more intimidating. He had the look of someone who'd seen his fair share of violence and had no qualms about adding to it. Rossi walked in, his expression calm but calculating. He nodded at Jackson and then looked directly at me. "Liam, good to see you again. I hope everything's in order." "It is," I replied, forcing a smile. "We're ready to finalize the deal." We moved to a table set up in the middle of the warehouse, where we had laid out more documents and cash. Everything Rossi needed to believe this was a legitimate transaction. Nate and his men were hidden in strategic positions around the building, waiting for the right moment to strike. As we went through the motions of the deal, I could feel the tension building. My hands were clammy, and my heart was pounding so loudly I was sure Rossi could hear it. But I forced myself to stay calm, to play the role I had crafted over the past weeks. Rossi's men inspected the documents, nodding in approval. Everything seemed to be going smoothly, but I knew we were far from safe. The signal to the police was ready to be sent, but we had to wait until Rossi gave the final confirmation. Then, just as Rossi was about to sign off on the deal, the unexpected happened. The third man, the one I hadn't recognized, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Jackson. "I've seen you before," he said slowly, his voice thick with suspicion. "You're not just some businessman. You're that guy who's been causing trouble. The one who's been asking too many questions." Jackson paled, and my heart sank. This wasn't part of the plan. Rossi's bodyguards immediately raised their weapons, pointing them at us. The tension in the room escalated from uncomfortable to life-threatening in a heartbeat. "What's going on here, Jackson?" Rossi's voice was low and menacing. "Is this some kind of setup?" "No," Jackson stammered, raising his hands defensively. "It's not. This is just business, I swear." But it was too late. Rossi's eyes locked onto mine, and I could see the realization dawning on him. He spat, his voice filled with venom. "You've been playing me this whole time." I knew I had to act fast. There was no time to explain, no time to negotiate. I reached for my phone and sent the signal to the police, triggering the raid we had prepared for. But Rossi was quicker than I expected. He pulled out a gun, aiming it directly at Jackson. "You think you can double-cross me?" he snarled. Before I could react, a shot rang out, echoing through the warehouse. Jackson collapsed to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. I froze, horror gripping me as I realized what had just happened. Rossi turned his gun on me, but before he could pull the trigger, the sound of sirens filled the air. The police had arrived, and the warehouse was suddenly swarming with armed officers. Nate's men moved in as well, catching Rossi's bodyguards off guard. A firefight erupted, bullets flying in every direction. I dove for cover, my mind racing. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Jackson was supposed to survive. We were supposed to take down Rossi together. But now, everything was falling apart. Amidst the chaos, I saw Rossi trying to make a break for it, heading towards a side exit. I knew I couldn't let him escape. Fueled by a mixture of adrenaline and rage, I grabbed a nearby metal pipe and charged after him. Rossi made it to the exit just as I caught up to him. I swung the pipe with all my strength, striking him across the back. He stumbled, dropping his gun, and I tackled him to the ground. We struggled, but I was running on pure instinct, driven by everything this man had taken from me. Finally, I managed to pin him down, pressing the pipe against his throat. "It's over, Rossi," I growled, the anger boiling over. "You're done." Rossi gasped for air, his eyes wide with fear. "You don't have the guts to kill me," he sneered, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. He was right. I couldn't bring myself to end his life, no matter how much I wanted to. But I didn't have to. The police stormed through the exit, weapons drawn, and I backed away, letting them take Rossi into custody. As they hauled him away, I collapsed against the wall, the weight of everything that had just happened crashing down on me. The warehouse was a mess of shattered glass, spent bullet casings, and blood. The police swarmed over Rossi's men, securing the scene, but all I could think about was Jackson. I stumbled back inside, my legs feeling like lead. Jackson lay on the floor, motionless. A pool of blood spreading out around him. I dropped to my knees beside him, checking for a pulse. It was weak, but it was there. "Hang on, Jackson," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Help's coming." The paramedics arrived moments later, pushing me aside as they worked to stabilize Jackson. I watched, helpless, as they loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him to the hospital. I should have felt relief. Rossi was in custody, his operation dismantled. But all I felt was emptiness. Jackson had been many things: a cheater, a criminal, a man who had destroyed my life. But in the end, he had also been my ally, the one who had helped me take down a monster. As I sat there, surrounded by the wreckage of everything that had happened, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. I had crossed a line I never thought I would, and now I had to live with the consequences. The days that followed felt like a blur. The police took my statement, asking question after question about my involvement with Rossi and the events that had led up to the raid. I told them everything, leaving out nothing. There was no point in hiding the truth now. Jackson survived, though just barely. The bullet had missed any vital organs, but he was in critical condition, and the doctors weren't sure if he would make a full recovery. I visited him once, standing outside his hospital room, looking in at the man who had once been my enemy, now lying helpless in a bed. As I stood there, I couldn't help but think about everything that had led us to this point. Jackson had done terrible things, but in the end, he had tried to make amends, to help me bring down Rossi. I couldn't say I forgave him, but I also couldn't bring myself to hate him anymore. The news broke quickly. Rossi's arrest made headlines, and the media swarmed the story. They painted Rossi as the mastermind of a massive criminal enterprise, the man behind countless illegal activities. My name was kept out of the spotlight, thanks to the police who were keen on protecting me as a key witness. But no matter how much they tried to shield me, my life was irreparably changed. The adrenaline that had fueled me for so long was gone, leaving behind only exhaustion and a gnawing emptiness. I had lost Rachel, nearly lost my life, and seen the darkness that people like Rossi thrived in. I spent hours and days thinking about everything that had happened. About the choices I had made, the lines I had crossed. Rachel reached out to me, leaving messages I couldn't bring myself to return. There was no going back to the way things were, no erasing what had been done. We were different people now, shaped by the decisions we had made. One day, I received a call from the police. They had finished their investigation and were ready to proceed with prosecuting Rossi and his associates. They wanted me to testify, to be the key witness that would seal Rossi's fate. I agreed. I had come this far, and I wasn't about to back out now. But as the court date approached, I found myself dreading it. Not because of Rossi or the trial, but because it meant revisiting everything I had gone through. The day of the trial arrived like a dark cloud hanging over my head. I had spent weeks preparing with the prosecutors, going over every detail of my testimony, reliving the events that had led to Rossi's arrest. They assured me that my testimony would be the nail in the coffin, that Rossi wouldn't be able to worm his way out of this. But that did little to ease the anxiety gnawing at my gut. I sat in the courtroom, dressed in a suit that felt too tight, watching as the room filled with people, lawyers, reporters, and spectators eager to see the infamous Victor Rossi brought to justice. Rossi himself sat at the defense table, his demeanor calm, almost smug, as if he believed he could still talk his way out of this. His eyes met mine briefly, and a chill ran down my spine. He was dangerous, even now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The trial began with the usual formalities. The judge outlining the charges against Rossi, and the prosecution making its opening statement. They painted a picture of a ruthless criminal mastermind, a man who had used his wealth and connections to build an empire of corruption and crime. They described how I, a regular guy who had been caught up in something far bigger than myself, had helped bring Rossi down. Then it was my turn. As I took the stand, I could feel every eye in the courtroom on me. My heart pounded in my chest, my mouth dry as I swore to tell the truth. The whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The prosecutor began by asking me to describe how I first got involved with Rossi, leading me through the story step by step. I told them everything: how I discovered Rachel's affair, how I confronted Jackson, how I spiraled into extreme sports and the desire for revenge. I described the night I kidnapped Jackson, how we discovered Rossi's criminal activities, and how we worked together to bring him down. As I spoke, I could see Rossi out of the corner of my eye. His expression unchanging, but there was a tension in the air, a feeling that the walls were closing in on him. I recounted the night of the raid, the chaos in the warehouse, the moment Rossi shot Jackson. I left nothing out, no detail too small. When I finished, the courtroom was silent. The prosecutor thanked me and turned to the defense attorney, who was already on his feet, ready to tear into my testimony. The cross-examination was brutal. Rossi's attorney questioned every decision I made, every action I took, trying to paint me as a vengeful, unstable man who had dragged Jackson into a dangerous game out of sheer spite. He brought up my involvement in Jackson's kidnapping, the violence that ensued, and my initial plan to use the information against Rossi for personal revenge. "Mr. Harris," the defense attorney said, his tone dripping with condescension, "isn't it true that you were only interested in revenge? That you orchestrated this entire situation to punish Mr. Rossi and Mr. Jackson for their involvement with your wife?" I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. At first, yes, I was angry and hurt. I wanted to make them pay. But when I discovered what Rossi was involved in, I knew it was bigger than that. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about stopping something truly evil. The attorney smirked, clearly unconvinced. "And yet, you took the law into your own hands. You kidnapped Mr. Jackson and committed acts of violence, and only then did you decide to involve the authorities. Isn't that right?" I didn't have a good answer for that. He was right, What I had done was illegal, reckless, and dangerous. But I had done it because I saw no other way. Yes, I admitted, my voice steady. I made mistakes. I broke the law. But I did what I thought I had to do to stop Rossi. And in the end, it worked. He's here because of what Jackson and I did. And I'd do it again if I had to. The defense attorney paused as if weighing his next move. Then he nodded and returned to his seat, clearly unsatisfied but unable to shake my testimony. The rest of the trial passed in a blur. Other witnesses were called: Nate, some of Rossi's former associates who had turned against him, even Rachel. She testified about her affair with Jackson, how it had started innocently but quickly spiraled out of control. She spoke about the guilt she felt, how she never imagined it would lead to something like this. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the closing arguments were made. And the jury was sent to deliberate. I sat in the courtroom, my nerves on edge, waiting for the verdict. Rossi looked calm, confident even as if he still believed he could win. Hours passed, each minute dragging by like a lifetime. Finally, the jury returned, and we all stood as the judge asked if they had reached a verdict. The foreman nodded. "We have, Your Honor." The courtroom was deathly silent as the verdict was read. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant, Victor Rossi, guilty. On the charge of racketeering, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendant guilty. The list went on, each guilty striking Rossi like a hammer blow. By the time the last charge was read, his confident facade had crumbled. He looked stunned as if he couldn't believe what was happening. The judge thanked the jury and set a date for sentencing. As the courtroom began to empty, I sat there, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Relief, yes, but also emptiness. The man who had caused so much pain, who had nearly destroyed my life, was going to prison. But it didn't bring back what I had lost. It didn't erase the past. Rachel approached me as I stood to leave, her expression tentative. "Liam," she said softly, "I'm so sorry. For everything." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between us. "Maybe one day," she began. But I cut her off. "Maybe," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But not today." She nodded, understanding. We had both been through too much, and the wounds were still too fresh. As she walked away, I realized that this chapter of my life was finally over. Rossi was going to prison, Jackson was recovering, and I was free to start again. But the scars would remain. And I knew it would be a long time before I could truly move on. The weeks after the trial were some of the hardest of my life. I had spent so long focused on bringing Rossi down that when it was finally over, I felt lost. I didn't know what to do with myself, or what direction to take. The adrenaline that had fueled me for so long was gone, leaving behind a void that I struggled to fill. I tried to return to a normal routine, but nothing felt the same. My old life was gone, shattered by the events of the past months. The friends I had, the places I used to go, everything reminded me of what I had lost. I spent days just wandering the city, trying to find some sense of purpose, some way to move forward. One day, as I walked along the beach where I had first discovered Rachel's affair, I realized that I couldn't stay in the city any longer. There were too many memories here, too much pain. If I was going to start over, I needed a clean break, a fresh start somewhere far away from everything that had happened. I began making plans to leave. I sold my house, packed up my belongings, and started looking for a new place to live. I didn't know where I would go, but I knew I needed to be somewhere quiet, somewhere I could heal and figure out what to do with the rest of my life. Nate helped me with the move. He had been my rock through everything, and I owed him more than I could ever repay. As we loaded the last of my boxes into the moving truck, he clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You sure about this?" he asked, his tone serious. "It's a big change." "I'm sure," I replied, looking out at the empty street where my life had once been. "I need to get away from here. Start fresh." Nate nodded, understanding. "If you ever need anything, you know where to find me." "I do," I said, grateful for his friendship. "Thanks, Nate, for everything." We said our goodbyes, and I climbed into my car, following the moving truck out of the city. As I drove away, I felt a sense of relief, but also sadness. This city had been my home, but it was also the place where everything had fallen apart. It was time to leave it behind. I drove for hours, heading north, away from the chaos and noise. I didn't have a specific destination in mind, just a general direction. I wanted to find a small town. Somewhere quiet and peaceful where I could take the time to heal and rebuild my life. Eventually, I found it, a small town nestled in the mountains, surrounded by forests and rivers. It was the kind of place where people still knew their neighbors, where life moved at a slower pace. It was perfect. I rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, a place where I could be alone with my thoughts. The first few days were strange, so quiet compared to the life I had known. But slowly, I began to adjust, finding comfort in the solitude. I spent my days hiking through the woods, fishing in the rivers, and reading books by the fireplace. It was peaceful, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. The nightmares still came, but they were less frequent, and I started to sleep through the night more often. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I realized that I was starting to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find happiness again. That I could rebuild my life, piece by piece, and find a way to move on. It would take time, and there would be setbacks, but I knew I could do it. I had survived the worst, and I had come out the other side stronger. Now, it was time to start living again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I took a deep breath and smiled. It wasn't going to be easy, but I was ready. Ready to start over, ready to heal, and ready to find a new beginning. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't have to define me. I could build a new life, one that was better, stronger, and more resilient. And as I looked out at the beautiful, peaceful landscape in front of me, I knew that I had made the right choice. This was my fresh start, and I was ready to embrace it. Life in the small mountain town was exactly what I needed. The days were peaceful, and the quiet gave me time to reflect on everything that had happened. The town's simplicity was a balm for my soul, helping me slowly put the pieces of my life back together. I wasn't entirely healed, but I was on my way. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves began to change color and the air turned cool, I was chopping wood outside my cabin. The rhythm of the axe against the wood was comforting, a physical task that kept my mind focused. I had come to appreciate these simple, repetitive tasks. They gave my restless thoughts somewhere to go. I was about to take a break when I heard the sound of a car engine approaching. It was unusual to have visitors. Most people in town kept to themselves, and I hadn't made many friends yet. My first thought was that it might be Nate, coming to check on me. But as the car pulled up, I saw that it wasn't Nate's truck. It was a sleek, black sedan, a car that looked completely out of place in this quiet, rural area. I set down the axe and wiped the sweat from my brow, watching as the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out, dressed in a dark suit, his face hidden behind sunglasses. He was tall, with a commanding presence that immediately put me on edge. "Liam Harris?" the man asked, his voice calm and controlled. "Yeah, that's me," I replied, my guard up. "Who's asking?" The man reached into his jacket pocket, and for a moment, my instincts flared, but he only pulled out a badge. "Special Agent Mark Stevens, FBI." My heart skipped a beat. The FBI? What could they possibly want with me? I thought all of this was behind me, that I had left everything in the past. But as Agent Stevens approached, I knew that wasn't the case. "I'm not in any trouble, am I?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "No, Mr. Harris, you're not," Stevens said, his tone professional. "But I do need to speak with you. It's about Victor Rossi." The mention of Rossi's name sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't thought about him in weeks, had tried to put the trial and everything connected to it behind me. But now, it was all coming back, the memories I had worked so hard to bury resurfacing. "What about him?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know the answer. "Rossi's trial was just the beginning," Stevens explained. "He was involved in a much larger criminal network, and we've been working to dismantle it piece by piece. We've already arrested several of his associates, but there's more to do. And we believe you might have information that could help us." I shook my head, taking a step back. "I told everything I knew at the trial. I don't have anything else to give you." Stevens didn't seem surprised by my response. "I understand this isn't something you want to relive, Mr. Harris. But this is important. Rossi's organization is dangerous, and we need to take it down before more people get hurt." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I'm not sure what you think I can do. I'm just trying to move on with my life." "I get that," Stevens said, his voice softening slightly. But Rossi had connections, people were still trying to identify. You were close to him, closer than most. Maybe you heard something, saw something that didn't seem important at the time but could be a crucial piece of the puzzle. I hesitated, torn between wanting to help and the overwhelming urge to keep the past where it belonged. I had done my part, I had testified, I had helped put Rossi behind bars. Wasn't that enough? Stevens seemed to sense my reluctance. Look, I'm not asking you to dive back into all of this. But if you could just think about it, see if anything comes to mind, it could make a big difference. I stared at the ground, the leaves crunching under my boots as I shifted my weight. Part of me wanted to tell him to leave, to go back to his car and drive away, taking all the bad memories with him. But another part of me knew that if I didn't at least try to help, I'd never forgive myself. Finally, I nodded. All right, I'll think about it. Stevens gave me a small, appreciative smile. That's all I'm asking. Here's my card. Call me if anything comes to mind. He handed me a business card, and I slipped it into my pocket without looking at it. As Stevens walked back to his car, I felt a weight settle on my shoulders, the peacefulness of the afternoon shattered by his visit. The black sedan pulled away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stood there for a long time, the axe still in my hand, wondering what I had just agreed to. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of Rossi and the FBI. I had tried so hard to escape that world, to leave behind the chaos and danger that had nearly destroyed me. But now, it felt like it was all creeping back, pulling me into the darkness I had fought so hard to escape. I tossed and turned, memories flashing through my mind. Rossi's cold smile, the gunshots, the fear in Jackson's eyes as he bled on the warehouse floor. I could still hear the sirens and the shouts of the FBI agents as they stormed the building. I could still feel the weight of the gun in my hand, the desperation as I made a choice that would change everything. As the night dragged on, I realized that there was something nagging at the back of my mind, a faint memory that I couldn't quite grasp. It was like a puzzle piece that didn't fit, something I had overlooked in the chaos. But no matter how hard I tried to remember, it remained just out of reach. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, I gave up on sleep and got out of bed. I needed to clear my head, to think. I made a pot of coffee and sat on the porch, the cool mountain air biting at my skin as I sipped the hot drink. As the sun began to rise, casting a golden light over the trees, I tried to piece together the fragments of my memory. There had to be something I was missing, something important that Agent Stevens was hoping I'd remember. But what? I thought back to the night of the warehouse raid, replaying every detail in my mind. The tension, the fear, the chaos as Rossi's men tried to flee. I remembered the shouts, the gunfire, the moment when I saw Rossi with the gun aimed at Jackson. But then, there was something else. I closed my eyes, focusing on that moment. The sound of footsteps, the click of a door. I had heard something just before Rossi fired the gun. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it seemed significant. There was a door in the back of the warehouse, one that led to a storage room. I had seen someone disappear into it just before the shooting started. My heart began to race as the memory sharpened. I had been so focused on stopping Rossi that I hadn't thought about who might have been in that room. But now, I realized that it could have been someone important, someone who had escaped unnoticed in the chaos. I had to find out who it was. If this person was connected to Rossi, they could be a key player in his organization, someone the FBI hadn't caught yet. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead I had. I grabbed my phone and pulled out Agent Stevens' card, dialing the number before I could change my mind. The phone rang twice before Stevens answered, his voice alert despite the early hour. "Stevens, it's Harris," I said, my voice steady. "I think I remembered something. There was someone else in the warehouse that night, someone who got away." Stevens was silent for a moment, processing what I had just told him. "You're sure about this?" "Yeah," I replied, the memory now clear in my mind. I didn't see their face, but I heard them. They were in a storage room in the back. I think they got out during the chaos. Stevens didn't hesitate. "I'll have my team look into it. This could be the break we've been waiting for. If we can identify this person, it could lead us to the rest of Rossi's network." "Do you think it could be someone important?" I asked, hoping for some reassurance. "It's possible," Stevens said, his tone serious. "Whoever they are, they're connected to Rossi. That makes them dangerous." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Keep me in the loop?" "Of course," Stevens said. And Harris, thanks for calling. You might have just helped us take down the rest of Rossi's operation. After we hung up, I sat on the porch, the weight of the conversation sinking in. I had done it. I had reopened the door to a world I thought I had left behind. But if it meant stopping Rossi's associates, then it was worth it. As the sun rose higher, bathing the mountains in light, I felt a sense of determination settle over me. This wasn't over yet, but I was ready. I had faced worse before, and I had come out the other side stronger. Whatever happened next, I would be ready. And this time, I wouldn't let fear hold me back. The days that followed were tense. I tried to maintain the peaceful routine I'd established in the mountains, but it was difficult knowing that I was once again tangled up in Rossi's world. Agent Stevens kept me informed, but the updates were few and far between. I had done what I could, but now, it was up to the FBI. One evening, just as I was starting to lose hope that anything would come of my tip, my phone rang. It was Stevens. "We found him," Stevens said, skipping any preamble. His voice was laced with urgency, and I could hear the adrenaline in his tone. "Who?" I asked, my heart racing. "The guy from the warehouse. His name is Dominic Ferraro. He's one of Rossi's top lieutenants. Been on our radar for a while, but he's managed to stay out of sight. Your lead gave us just what we needed to track him down." My breath caught in my throat. This was bigger than I had expected. "So what happens now?" "We're planning a sting operation," Stevens explained. "We've got Ferraro under surveillance, and we're coordinating with local law enforcement to take him down. But there's something you need to know, Liam. This isn't just about Ferraro. We've uncovered evidence that Rossi's network is more extensive than we thought. Taking down Ferraro could lead us to even bigger targets." I wasn't sure how to feel. On one hand, I was glad that my information had been useful, that it might help dismantle Rossi's entire operation. But on the other hand, I couldn't shake the fear that I was once again getting in over my head. "Do you need me to do anything?" I asked, half hoping that Stevens would say no. "There is one thing," Stevens replied. "We need you to come back to the city. Ferraro is going to be at a meeting with some of Rossi's other associates, and we need someone who can identify him without a doubt. You're one of the few people who's seen him up close. We could really use your help." I hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Going back to the city, and getting involved in an FBI sting. It was everything I had tried to avoid. But at the same time, I couldn't just walk away now. I had come this far, and if I could help put an end to Rossi's criminal empire once and for all, I had to do it. "All right," I said finally. "I'll do it." "Great," Stevens said, relief evident in his voice. "We'll arrange for your transport and get you briefed on the operation. Don't worry, we'll keep you safe." As I hung up the phone, I couldn't help but wonder if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. But deep down, I knew there was no turning back now. I was committed, for better or worse. The next morning, I packed a small bag and made my way down the mountain. As I drove back toward the city, the familiar skyline came into view, and with it, the memories I had tried so hard to leave behind. But this time, I wasn't running away. I was facing it head on. The FBI briefed me as soon as I arrived. The plan was to intercept Ferraro and his associates during their meeting in a high-rise building downtown. The stakes were high. If we could pull this off, it could cripple Rossi's organization. But if something went wrong, the consequences could be disastrous. Stevens introduced me to the team, a group of seasoned agents who exuded calm professionalism. They walked me through the operation, explaining my role and what to expect. I would be positioned in a nearby surveillance van, identifying Ferraro and confirming his presence before the team moved in. It was a surreal experience, sitting in that van surrounded by monitors and equipment, knowing that I was about to play a part in something so much bigger than myself. The tension in the air was palpable, every agent was focused and ready for action. As the time for the meeting approached, the team took their positions. The building was under surveillance, with agents disguised as maintenance workers, janitors, and even delivery personnel. The level of coordination was impressive, and it gave me a small measure of confidence that maybe, just maybe, this would go off without a hitch. Finally, the moment came. Ferraro arrived, flanked by two men who looked every bit as dangerous as he did. The FBI cameras picked them up immediately, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I saw Ferraro's face on the monitor. There was no mistaking it. That was the man who had slipped through our fingers on that fateful night. "Is that him?" Stevens' voice crackled through my earpiece. That's him, I confirmed, my voice steady despite the nerves roiling in my stomach. Copy that. Team, move in. I watched on the monitor as the agents moved into position, their approach swift and coordinated. My heart pounded in my chest as the tension built, every second feeling like an eternity. And then, just as the agents were about to close in, something went wrong. One of Ferraro's men spotted the approaching agents and shouted a warning. Chaos erupted as Ferraro and his associates pulled out weapons, firing at the agents in a desperate attempt to escape. "Get down," I heard someone shout through the earpiece. And I watched in horror as the situation spiraled out of control. Gunfire echoed through the building as the agents returned fire, but Ferraro was quick, too quick. He and one of his men managed to slip out a side exit, disappearing into the night. "Damn it," Stevens cursed, his voice filled with frustration. "We've lost them." I sat there in the van, my hands trembling as the reality of what had just happened sank in. The operation had failed, and Ferraro was still out there, more dangerous than ever. The hours that followed were a blur. The FBI scrambled to regroup, issuing an all-points bulletin for Ferraro and his remaining associates. Stevens was livid, barking orders into his radio as he tried to salvage what was left of the operation. I could see the frustration and disappointment on the faces of the agents around me, the sting of failure weighing heavily on all of us. I felt a deep sense of dread settle in my gut. I had come back to the city, risked everything, and it hadn't been enough. Ferraro was still out there, and now, he knew the FBI was after him. That made him even more dangerous. Stevens finally pulled me aside, his expression grim. "Liam, I'm sorry this went down the way it did. We had him. If only we had moved a second faster." I shook my head, trying to push down the guilt that was threatening to overwhelm me. "It's not your fault. We did everything we could." "Maybe," Stevens said, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. "But this isn't over. We'll keep hunting him down. And we'll take him in eventually. In the meantime, we need to get you out of here. You're a loose end now, and that makes you a target." I hadn't thought about that, but as soon as he said it, I realized he was right. Ferraro knew I had helped the FBI, and that put a bullseye on my back. "We'll put you in protective custody," Stevens continued. "You'll be safe until we catch Ferraro." I didn't like the idea of going into hiding, but I knew it was the smart move. "How long do you think that'll take?" "As long as it takes," Stevens said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We'll get him, Liam. But until then, you need to stay low." I nodded, accepting the reality of the situation. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only option. The FBI quickly arranged for me to be taken to a safe house in an undisclosed location. It was a far cry from my cabin in the mountains, but at least I would be out of Ferraro's reach. The days in the safe house were long and uneventful. I had nothing to do but wait, counting the hours as they dragged by. I tried to keep busy, reading books and watching TV, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the sting operation and everything that had gone wrong. I couldn't help but feel responsible, like I had somehow failed by not being able to stop Ferraro when I had the chance. Stevens checked in with me regularly, but the news was always the same: Ferraro was still on the run, and the FBI was working around the clock to track him down. Each day that passed without an arrest felt like another nail in the coffin. The tension building as the hunt dragged on. One evening, as I sat alone in the safe house, I received a call from an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment before answering, my heart pounding in my chest. "Liam," a familiar voice said on the other end of the line. "It's Dominic." My blood ran cold. Ferraro had found me. "Don't bother trying to run," Ferraro continued, his tone casual, as if we were old friends catching up. "I've got people watching you. But don't worry, I'm not interested in hurting you, yet." "What do you want?" I asked, forcing myself to stay calm. "I want to talk," Ferraro said. "Face to face. You've been a thorn in my side for too long, and I think it's time we settled this." I didn't know what to say. Ferraro was offering me a chance to confront him, but I knew it was a trap. Yet, I couldn't help but feel that this was my last shot at ending this nightmare once and for all. "Where and when?" I finally asked. "I'll send you the details," Ferraro said. "Don't keep me waiting. Liam, you won't like the consequences." The line went dead, and I sat there in stunned silence. Ferraro had me right where he wanted me, and I was out of options. But as much as I feared what might happen, I knew I couldn't walk away. This was it, the final showdown. Whatever happened next, I had to be ready. There was no turning back now. The minutes ticked by as I sat in the safe house, the tension in the air so thick I could practically taste it. Dominic Ferraro had found me, and he wanted a face-to-face meeting. I had no illusions about what that meant. This wasn't an offer for a peaceful resolution. It was a final move in a deadly game, one that Ferraro intended to win. I quickly called Stevens to inform him of the situation. His voice was tight with concern as he listened to what Ferraro had said. "This is bad, Liam," Stevens said after a moment of silence. "He's not going to let you walk away from this." "I know," I replied, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. "But this is our chance to end it. Right? If I can draw him out, you and your team can move in." "It's too dangerous," Stevens countered. "He's got nothing to lose now. He's going to be prepared for anything we throw at him. But he's expecting me to come alone," I said, my mind racing as I pieced together a plan. "If you can track the location and move in quietly, we might be able to take him by surprise. This might be our only shot, Stevens. If I don't go, he'll disappear again, and who knows what he'll do next." Stevens hesitated, and I could tell he was weighing the risks. Finally, he let out a resigned sigh. "All right, but we do this my way. I'll have a team ready to go, but Liam, you need to be careful. If anything feels off, you get out of there. Understood?" "Understood," I agreed, knowing full well that this could be the most dangerous thing I'd ever done. But I had come too far to back down now. A few hours later, I received a text message with the details of the meeting. Ferraro had chosen an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place that was isolated and far from prying eyes. It was the perfect spot for a final showdown. Stevens and his team were already en route when I left the safe house. My hands were steady on the wheel as I drove, but my mind was racing with 1,000 possibilities. I knew I had to keep my wits about me if I was going to survive this encounter. As I approached the warehouse, I parked the car a few blocks away and made my way on foot, keeping to the shadows. The night was quiet, the streets deserted, and the only sound was the soft crunch of gravel beneath my boots. When I reached the warehouse, I paused for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves. The building loomed before me, dark and foreboding, its broken windows like empty eyes staring out into the night. I knew Stevens and his team were close, but I couldn't rely on them to save me if things went south. This was on me. I had to be smart, stay calm, and be ready for anything. I pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. The interior was dimly lit by a few flickering overhead lights, casting long shadows that danced across the concrete floor. I could see Ferraro standing near the center of the room, his figure silhouetted against the weak light. He was alone, but I knew better than to trust appearances. "You came," Ferraro's voice echoed off the walls, his tone casual, as if this were just another business meeting. He turned to face me, a cold smile playing on his lips. "I wasn't sure you had it in you." "Liam, why?" I asked, keeping my voice steady as I stepped closer. "Why go through all this trouble? You could have just walked away." Ferraro chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "Walked away? After everything you've done?" "No, Liam, I couldn't just walk away. You've been a thorn in my side for too long, and I'm not the kind of man who leaves loose ends." "So this is it, then?" I asked, trying to buy time as I scanned the room for any sign of Stevens and his team. "You kill me, and what? Go on with your life like nothing happened?" "I suppose that's one way it could end," Ferraro replied, taking a step closer. "Or maybe I just leave you here to rot after I'm done with you. Either way, I win." I clenched my fists, ready to fight if it came down to it. "You're not going to win, Ferraro. Not this time." Ferraro's smile widened, but before he could respond, the sound of movement caught my attention. Out of the shadows, several armed men emerged, their weapons trained on me. It was an ambush, just as I had feared. But I didn't panic. I knew Stevens was out there, and I had to trust that he was ready to move in. I just needed to keep Ferraro talking. "You think these guys scare me?" I asked, my voice dripping with bravado. "You're just a coward, hiding behind your muscle. You can't even face me one-on-one." Ferraro's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought my taunt had gotten under his skin. But then he laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Brave words, Liam, but they won't save you." Just then, the sound of sirens blared in the distance, growing louder by the second. Ferraro's expression shifted from amusement to fury as he realized what was happening. Cops! One of his men shouted, and the room erupted into chaos. Stevens and his team burst through the doors, weapons drawn, as Ferraro's men scrambled to defend themselves. Gunfire rang out, the deafening noise filling the warehouse as the two sides clashed. In the midst of the chaos, Ferraro made a move to escape, but I was faster. I lunged at him, tackling him to the ground just as he reached for his gun. We struggled, the sound of gunfire and shouts fading into the background as I focused on one thing: stopping him, once and for all. Ferraro was strong, but I fought with everything I had, years of pent-up anger and fear fueling my every move. We grappled on the cold concrete floor, each of us trying to gain the upper hand. Finally, I managed to knock the gun from his hand, sending it skidding across the floor. Ferraro snarled, his eyes wild with rage, but I didn't give him a chance to recover. I threw a punch, catching him square in the jaw, and he collapsed to the ground, dazed. Stevens and his team swarmed the room, quickly overpowering Ferraro's remaining men. The fight was over in minutes, and when the dust settled, Ferraro lay on the ground, handcuffed and surrounded by agents. I stood over him, my breath coming in heavy gasps as the reality of what had just happened sank in. It was over. The nightmare that had consumed my life for so long was finally over. Stevens approached me, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You did good, Liam. We got him." I nodded, unable to find the words to express the overwhelming relief that washed over me. Ferraro was in custody, and with him, the last vestiges of the fear and anger that had haunted me for so long. As the agents led Ferraro away, he shot me one last venomous glare, but I met his gaze with calm determination. He had tried to break me, to destroy everything I held dear, but in the end, I had won. I turned to leave the warehouse, the weight of the past few months lifting from my shoulders. The fight was over, but the scars it had left would remain. I knew I would never be the same man I was before, but maybe that was okay. I had faced my demons and come out the other side stronger. And as I walked out into the night, I realized that, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what the future held. I had survived the worst. And now, it was time to rebuild my life, one step at a time.